we can kick off. All right. So I guess, first of all, welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. The first question I've got is, I think, Jamie, I'll go with you just to set up the conversation, then I'll ask Simon the same question. But Jamie, for sport or physical activity to be used to promote a mental health outcome, in your experience looking at surf therapy specifically, what are the kind of the essential ingredients of the programs? Like when you've been going to these different places around the world, looking at surfing being used as a health intervention or mental health intervention.
So fortunately, Tim had shared the questions in advance, so I can pretend I'm Tim for a second. And the sort of first question we really want to explore, both with myself and Simon, is around looking at what are the key components and structures that we need within sporting programs and sporting interventions to actually impact on mental health. And certainly I can answer from my point of view from the research I've conducted around surf therapy. There are certain components that while tied to the sport are actually almost completely independent. So in my research, we found across surf therapy across multiple populations, including working with Waves for Change in Liberia in a post-conflict setting, the most important, almost foundational sort of mediator we found is the creation of a safe space around the intervention. So before the sport can be used in any manner, a safe space needs to be created. A safe space is a bit of a jargon word that appears in a lot of literature and yet still isn't sort of universally defined. But in the terms of the research we've been doing, we've seen a space that's free from judgment, a space where people can sort of be themselves. So there's that real sort of emotional safety where participants can talk about maybe things that aren't going so well. These are all things that maybe aren't natural to a surfing program at all. So that safe space has to be created first before you can do anything around mental health. And I would note actually something that's come up in my research, actually everywhere I've been, maybe slightly more surprisingly seeing this or maybe sadly not surprisingly seeing in a developed context as well in the UK and in Australia, is that safe space also has to be a physically safe space. Spoken to participants around the world who saw their surf club as somewhere where they knew they weren't going to be at risk of physical violence, where they knew, it was just a break from maybe the realities they were living in. And while a surf therapy intervention or any other kind of sporting intervention can't necessarily, go in and change that reality for that individual directly, it can't go in and take them away from any exposure to the kind of violence they're living in their lives. Having access to that space where they know they will be safe, where they know they can talk about things that are going on at home or in the community, and having access to mentors who can facilitate that and who can offer advice. I'm actually, one of my current research priorities is really looking at that balance of especially in contexts where there is more clinical support. At what point, how do we involve clinicians in this process? But for example, my research in Liberia, the mentors in the surf therapy program there were fulfilling a key sort of mental health element that participants otherwise would have no access to. The mental health infrastructure in Liberia is extremely limited. There's one clinical psychologist for the whole country. So they're providing a service that otherwise people wouldn't have access to. And while they may not themselves be trained clinical practitioners, the work that Waves for Change, for example, has done is based on evidence-based research. It's based on the coaches have been trained based on getting that balance again between what we can train a community practitioner to and what they should be doing. They're providing a vital service. And the other thing I say about safe spaces, and this is something that's I've really realized over the last sort of 18 months, is I think there's something that we'll take for granted. I think a lot of us have maybe over the course of what's happened with COVID, we've maybe realized that some of our safety may be based on friendships, families, things like that. They are things that we maybe take for granted and are hugely important in our day-to-day lives. I'm actually going down to see my parents in this week, and I had Christmas 2019. And being, my parents live in England, I'm up in Scotland. It's a 6-hour drive. It's nothing that difficult, but due to circumstances, how much I took that safe space for granted when I suddenly didn't have access to it. So I think there's something that that in terms of all of our mental health, we take for granted. And certainly in some of these more challenging contexts, in a post-conflict zone, for example, like Liberia, they can be hard to find. So for a sporting program to offer that is hugely valuable. And I think it sets the tone for then delivering a mental health focused program. And I guess the other key component I've seen that's really interesting is the way we use sport. And I was particularly, there's a sort of an anecdote I like to tell from my research with Ways for Change around sort of basic sort of coping and breathing to try and deal with anxiety. And we're seeing this is very popular now. You can go on apps, you can go on webinars about how you can use breathing to control, maybe anxious moments or reactions to anxiety or stress or trauma or various things like that. But in a classroom setting, there's only so much you can do. You're not necessarily practicing that in relationship to like a real physiological or emotional response. So much of mental health is physiological. It's around, sort of things that happen in our body that maybe until we just discuss them, we're not even aware of. And what we saw with Waves for Change in Liberia is the young people were learning these breathing exercises on the beach, but then were being encouraged to try them out when they fall off a wave, when they go under the water, when they experience, for anyone who doesn't surf, I mean, it doesn't matter how good a surfer you are, when you fall under the water, when you're not expecting it, there's a physiological response. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing can be affected. So then to be able to practice those skills that they've learned, those behaviors they've learned on the beach, actually practice them in response to real physiological sort of elements, seem to really mean that those skills actually transferred. And we were then seeing participants talk about how they were using them back home in their communities. So I think that combination of really thinking about how we can use the sport effectively as a vehicle for delivering the mental health components of any intervention we want to deliver, married to, and actually, to be honest, in my opinion, underpinned by that safe space that you create around the intervention, have probably been two of the more powerful mediators I've certainly seen in my research around mental health and the mental health delivered through sport. Tim, are you okay and back with us, or would you like me to pass the ball on, as it were?
I think I'm okay. I had a small heart attack when my Zoom decided to fail straight at the beginning, but no, Jamie, thank you very much for that answer. I think it's quite comprehensive. The idea of we can use physical activity to promote mental health, but there are certain core tenets that we try and stick to, and the idea of that kind of physical and emotional safe space, those mentors that are able to offer advice, and especially in kind of developing world settings where those mentors, access to clinicians isn't always there. Those mentors fill a huge role, and that transferable skill element of the physical activity as well. I think quite keen to pass this to Simon, because I know Simon's done a lot of research on this as well, and we were talking briefly just before the call about some of the work we've done with Justin Richards on this as well. I guess, Simon, in your research, similar questions like what are some of the integral components of these sport for development programs, physical activity programs that you found, to promote a mental health outcome? What are some of those core ingredients for you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I was kind of relieved when Jamie took over there, Tim, because I couldn't hear you, and I thought that it was my internet again that was a problem. So that was a bit of a relief. Look, I think Jamie gave a really comprehensive answer there that covered lots of different things from your great work. I think the thing that I would add there, the first thing for me, is clarity on what are we actually trying to achieve, who's the target population, and what are the desired outcomes. I think that's a really critical thing. This idea about mental health is such a broad term, and when we're talking about are we trying to promote positive mental well-being, are we trying to assist in treating mental ill health, and that could be mild depression right through to severe mental illness, which obviously sport and physical activity can't be a standalone treatment, but it can be a component of care. And it can be, particularly in low-resourced environments, it can be, when we don't have that mental health infrastructure, as Jamie was saying, it can be a really powerful strategy, but it doesn't replace, evidence-based mental health treatment. So I think really that clarity on who are we targeting and what are we trying to achieve is probably the first thing that I would say. Other than that, and this is probably, won't come as a surprise to anyone, but I think culture and context is absolutely critical when it comes to physical activity. And, for example, a lot of the work that I've done in humanitarian context has been in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar with the Rohingya community. And there's certain sports and activities that community value, that community prioritize, and that's what they want to do. And they actually don't need us to come in and say, look, this is how you play sport, or this is why sport is important. They know, they inherently know that's the case. They actually just, I see our role as being to facilitate access and to advocate for the resources that the community needs. On that note, the other thing that I think is critical is actually that lived experience, and that's the lived experience of people in the communities that we're working in, but also the lived experience of the struggles, the unique struggles and the unique barriers that the people in that community are facing. They're going to be the biggest advocates, and just in parallel, we have the exact same approach with the work that we're doing with people with post-traumatic stress disorder here in Australia, be it emergency service workers or veterans. The most powerful strategy and the most powerful component of those interventions is often the instructors, and it's harnessing those people with lived experience that can communicate with participants in a way that us as facilitators can't, simply because we just don't have that shared experience in exactly the same way. So I think the more we can prioritize investing in that lived experience workforce, the better, ideally. Another point there, I would just say referrals in and out. So thinking about what are our pathways in and out of our program, how are we screening and identifying people at high risk? What resources do we have in place to then refer on when additional mental health support is needed? And how are we actually identifying who's eligible for the programs, which comes back, I think, to my first point around who are we targeting and what's our desired outcome.
Yeah, Simon, and there's so much to unpack there, and I know that we've only got so much time, but I think one of the most important things you talk about, the idea of kind of cultural sensitivity, the lived experience, and the role that the coaches or the mentors play within that space, I think is essential. So knowing who's delivering these programs, I think you spoke about really powerfully. And as Jamie was saying, they are such a big ingredient and component of the intervention. And then similarly, knowing what is it we're trying to achieve? Is it a treatment program? Are we just trying to promote? And knowing where the boundaries of the program there, it's so important. And where do we connect with other services within our community? Understanding that, I think, is a really important point you make. So thank you very much. And I think it kind of...
Sorry, yeah. Tim, just on that note with the coaches, I think it's just, a good point. I think, hopefully people are really familiar with Justin Richards' work, his great work that was done in Gulu in northern Uganda. But for those that aren't, essentially it was evaluating a soccer intervention. And really what he found was that mental health outcomes did actually deteriorated among participants. And this was a really interesting, example of what happens when we probably don't provide the required training and support to coaching staff. And the idea that we really need to be thinking about participation over competition. If we just simply, as you said, drop in a sporting, a competition-based program with coaches that we don't train, that we don't provide support with, we actually can make things worse and we can do harm. So I think it's really important that, again, as Jamie said, it's critical that we actually focus on capacity building among that workforce. And that could be things like mental health first aid training, psychological first aid, whatever the training is, make sure that it's fit for purpose and meets the needs of those supervisors and supporters.
I think that's a really, really good point. And what we'll do after this video is we're going to be sharing the recording of this video, and we'll put some resources. So I'll find Justin's paper and I'll attach it, because there's one paper that we've often come back to as we've developed Ways for Change as well. And I think, somebody said something really important there, the idea of participation over competition. I might just chuck a question back to Jamie quickly, because we've been really fortunate over the last few years to work with some amazing partners, organizations using sports like yoga, skateboarding, a partner of ours in Somalia using a gardening project to promote well-being. And I guess this is the question that I've got to both of you, is how adaptable is sport or physical activity as a health promotion tool? I guess there is this idea within sport for development, can be quite evangelical at times, that we can just drop sport into a community. And Simon, as you found, it doesn't always lead to positive outcomes. And I guess this comes into the idea of, what are we trying to achieve, and where is sport adaptable within this context? So I guess, Jamie, maybe that question over to you, like how adaptable is sport? When we want to drop it in as a mental health intervention, how adaptable is it?
Well, yeah, I think the question is almost we have to flesh it and say not is sport adaptable, but sport has to be adaptable. I think, Simon, you hit it on the head there. We need to be clear on our outcomes, and at all stages, the sport or whatever activity we're using it kind of needs to be subservient to that. You know, there's no, I don't want to jump on the Justin Richards sort of cheerleading bandwagon, but that paper is so clear on, you know, just dropping in a sort of a standard football template, as it were. And again, I think I've seen programs where football does so much good as well, but just dropping it in and expecting the sport to change the world is just, I mean, it doesn't make sense apart from anything else, how the idea is pervaded for as long as it has. And we need to push back against it when we see it as well. I think that's our responsibility as researchers and our responsibility as practitioners and people delivering programs like this. We need to sort of push back against this idea that it is some kind of miracle cure for anything. So yeah, sport has to be completely adaptable to our outcomes. And I think there's a whole range of different activities in sports that can be made, you know, can be adapted to this. I actually, again, it kind of ties to your point, Simon, around context. And you know, as researchers, we certainly have our niches and our interests and our paradigms, and we need to upskill the coaches, as you say, because they're the experts in what they do. You know, I know quite a lot about surf therapy, but if I was to go into, say, a different sporting context, for example, skateboarding, I've got plenty of scars on my elbows and knees from where I've tried skateboarding. I definitely shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a coaching role. But if we can help, you know, facilitators of skateboarding to understand that those mental health pathways, or, you know, looking at their target population, the people they're working with and what they want to achieve, and actually sometimes really importantly helping them, you know, clarify that vision. You know, something that's very common in the third sector. We see sort of mission creep. We see, you know, mission statements almost defined by funding priorities rather than maybe what the population most needs. So actually working to make sure that we do have that clear vision of what we want to achieve with our intervention. But absolutely, it is a question of sport needs to be adaptable, not how adaptable can it be. And again, you touched on some of the awesome programs we work with. There was a great, we were doing a debrief of a session with Elman Peace, who are our partners in Somalia. They're doing wonderful work. And one of the basketball coaches on the debrief talked about how the big change for them was summed up in how they moved from talking about performance to progress, and how that sort of simple shift of focus, they felt changed the whole dynamic of the whole intervention. And suddenly it was talking about, there was all kinds of things going on around self-efficacy, and the participants all supporting each other through different things, where before there was a bit more of a competitive edge to it. So, and that's not to say competition is wrong in every setting, but we need to be very wary of it. And I think Justin's sort of research in Gulu is a great example of that. And certainly, yeah, again, it's on us as researchers, it's on us as clinicians that may be on the call, it's on us as experts in these fields to work with the experts in those sport fields, the experts, the coaches, the you know, the guys and girls who are living and breathing that experience you talked about, Simon, alongside their participants, and who can really deliver the things we want in a way that's actually going to land with their communities, that's going to be relevant both in a sort of contextual and a cultural way. And again, Tim, I think you hit it on the head when you used the term evangelical. You know, that's how sport sometimes is viewed, and it's how sport is still sometimes delivered. And yeah, I think there's an imperative for all of us in this field to really push back strongly about that. I know there's individuals on this call who have been doing that for a long time, but that idea still seems to pervade, and certainly we need to push back on that.
Cool, thanks, Jamie. And Simon, similar-ish question. I'm going to hopefully not going to chuck you under the bus here by diverting from the questions I shared with you, but I think, Jamie, you were talking about as designers of programs being quite intentional about understanding what parts of the physical activity we want to unlock in order to promote mental health. So I guess, Simon, similar-ish question, but are there sports or activities that you found that are more easily deployed in different community settings that have a more natural fit with a mental health outcome than others? And I ask that because, you know, if there are activities that have an easier fit in promoting mental health, maybe these are, you know, activities we could mainstream, but also understanding that there are other sports where we might need to be slightly more intentional about the way that we design them. So just in both your research, are there activities that you found that are, are easier to mold into a mental health space? And are there activities that you found that are slightly need a little bit more of an intentional focus on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a few different ways we could sort of take that. I mean, the first thing, let me just give a really quick overview of the evidence around physical activity and mental health or mental illness. Now, the first thing to say is that we've got, there is a really overwhelming, body of evidence around the benefits of physical activity for mental health across the spectrum, whether we're talking about the general population who may be experiencing, sub-threshold symptoms or poor mental health compared to people that are living with a mental illness, be that a serious mental illness, psychosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, right through to mild depression or, and anxiety, whatever it is. So regardless of where someone sits across that spectrum, physical activity can play a role in reducing symptoms. So the challenge is that the worse the symptoms, often the more difficult it is for someone to engage in activity. They need more support. They're going to need more resources to help that person overcome the barriers so that they can participate. So that's the first thing. Looking at the mode, the evidence around the types of exercise, there is no evidence that one type of exercise is better than another. So often the head-to-head comparisons we see is interventions looking at, or I often get asked about, well, is aerobic or resistance exercise better? Is team sports better than individual sports? And really the answer is, it doesn't matter. Some activity is going to be beneficial, and the type of activity or the type of exercise that is the best is the one that is going to work for that individual at their point in time in their life. Now, if that means it's surfing, if that means it's skateboarding, or if it's playing basketball, or if it's skipping rope, it doesn't actually matter. And the evidence is very clear that resistance aerobic, it's actually the same. I can see in a chat there's a question about water. There is a little bit of evidence that yes, when you add the green gym, so that's exercise outside, or the blue gym, exercise in water, there are added benefits. But the sort of magnitude of the effect there is quite small, and it depends on the individual. The other thing that I think is really critical is about adherence and about long-term engagement. And the biggest predictor of that is enjoyment. So the key thing is that someone has to enjoy the activity, and they have to be internally motivated to participate. So that's autonomously motivated, which means that they're choosing to engage in that activity because they value it, they see the benefits, and they want to do it. It's not that there's an external facilitator or doctor or nurse or one of us saying you should exercise because it will help you. And this is the same not just for the general population, but people living with depression. We've done a lot of research in affective disorders and psychotic disorders. It's the same thing, that autonomous motivation is consistently a predictor of long-term adherence. So our programs need to be thinking about, how do we foster that? How do we build that autonomous motivation? That comes from building enjoyment. It comes from building that safe space that Jamie talked about, so that people feel welcome, they enjoy it, and they then want to do it over the long term. Tim, does that answer your question?
It does. And it also leads on to the next one. Because I think there are so many barriers and so many challenges, especially in kind of humanitarian contexts where sport is introduced. I guess, speaking just from my own perspective, making sure that the sport is fun and accessible and that people want to come to it, or are we using sport to bolt on like a curriculum that kids really don't find fun, so they just don't come along? Like, how are we, what are some of the barriers, I suppose, to designing physical activity programs in resource poor settings that kids want to be part of? And I guess there's quite a cool discussion here, because Jamie, you've actually designed a program and delivered it in Scotland, where there's lots of other resources that you can refer people to. Simon, conversely, in Cox's Bazaar, where quite often the sporting program, the physical activity program is quite often isolated. It operates like in its own bubble. And I guess to both of you, what are some of the biggest challenges to delivering like a physical activity for mental health program in a place like Cox's Bazaar, in a humanitarian setting, versus delivering something like the Wave Project up in Scotland, Jamie, where you've got access to slightly more resources? So I suppose, yeah, Simon, question to you first, I guess. What are some of the biggest challenges in a place like Cox's Bazaar? Conversely, Jamie, to your experience in Scotland.
I think what I'd probably start with is, how do we access the most vulnerable? So, I mentioned earlier about people experiencing the highest level of symptoms, or the most symptoms are going to be the most difficult to engage, are going to require the most support. I would say that they typically fall through the cracks, and they fall through the cracks not only in places like Cox's Bazar, but they fall through the cracks in places like here in Sydney, Australia. We stand to have to get the biggest benefit from these interventions by reaching the most vulnerable, but they're the ones who are least likely to come. They're least likely to have that access. So I think when we're designing our programs, it's thinking about how can we do that to reach not the ones that are around us that we could see, but the people we can't see and the people that aren't coming. They're the ones that we need to try and work out how. When we think about sport and the barriers in those low resource environments, I think again culture and context is key. It's about working with local community, because I think one of the most powerful things about sport is that it is this universal language. It is completely transcultural. A close colleague of mine who I first worked with in Bangladesh, Sean Nemaran, he used to talk about, if you give a kid a ball, they're going to kick it and they're going to look for a friend to kick it to. And I think that beautifully sums up the social, the sort of physical, the benefits that sport and how powerful sport can be. So I think the barriers are saying, look, we're in a resource poor context, but people are still going to play sport. They're still going to engage. In Cox's, people would use garbage bags, taped up, and that would be the soccer ball. So they're going to find ways to move. Just another example from some of the work that we did there was looking at how the community felt about sport as a mental health intervention. And we heard stories of women in camp. So in the refugee camp, this is the largest refugee camp in the world. The women would wake up before the men are awake, and that was a safety issue. And they would go on a walk together around the camp. It was like a women's walking group. And this was something that they had started themselves. There was no NGO, there was no outside influence. They did that because they identified it was a way of dealing with distress and tension and those mental health symptoms. So there's no resources required there. It's actually just saying, okay, you've got this group happening. How can we use those women as champions, support them to go and engage other women who otherwise wouldn't come?
And Simon, it's a great response. I actually think it speaks a little bit to the question Paul just dropped into the chat that we'll come back to in about 10 minutes or so. I guess just one quite practical question before we go to Jamie is, and it's something we struggle with in South Africa because social services here are very overstretched. How do you find the most vulnerable in those contexts? There are lots of referral pathways in Australia, the UK, Scotland. In South Africa, and I'm assuming Cox is very different, we rely very heavily on setting up our own referral pathways here. How do you identify the most vulnerable people in Cox's?
Yeah, so I was working as a mental health officer with a UN agency in Cox's, and what was really interesting when we looked at the data around what the mental health team was doing, a significant percentage, so it was about, I think at the time it was maybe a third or so of everything they were doing was organising sport events. So it's something that the mental health teams are doing naturally, they're turning to naturally in low resource settings, but yet there is very little support, there's very little training. So I would say the first thing we need to do is we need far better integration between the sports sector and the mental health sector. The mental health sector need training around sport and physical activity just as much as the sport and physical activity, physiotherapy, allied health, and need training in mental health as well. So that there's so much opportunity there for those sectors. And I know the great work that you guys are doing is helping to bring that together. But I think that's the key. That's the way that we're going to actually achieve it.
Awesome. And Jamie, do you want to touch a little bit more on that in Scotland? I know we're disappearing a little bit off script here, but I think that's okay because there's some really cool conversations coming up, because I think that conversation of access is so important. And I'm just having a look at the people that are joining us and some of the communities they're working. And I think this is quite a useful practical tool for us. Because in Scotland, for example, Jamie, for those who don't know, founded the WAVE Project up in Scotland. So it's the Scottish chapter of this very successful organisation called the WAVE Project. Can you talk to us about how you created access in Scotland for young people with mental health challenges? Because I think that's a really good example of using your local resources to create access for the most vulnerable. Jamie, do you want to just take us through that quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. It was certainly a journey. The first time I walked into an NHS office and told them I want to take a bunch of kids into the North Sea to try and help their mental health, I certainly got a reaction. But yeah, it was certainly. I mean, Simon, it's exactly that was one of the things I put the most work into in my years at the WAVE Project. So I was there for about 5 years, and we took it from a small pilot with 20 children to working with 150 children a year in the local area. And yeah, I think that initially it was so hard to reach the people that, you know, long term I really wanted to reach. And actually what we did in the start is we worked with, I found a few gatekeepers, as it were, who just got it, who had obviously been involved in some kind of similar project, or who just understood that, you know, okay, I see what you're trying to do here. And that got us, that basically got us our participants for our pilots. And to be honest, the thing that enabled us to plug ourselves into the referral pathways that the WAVE project now has access to, and the WAVE project across the UK is now oversubscribed from the NHS. So specifically CAMS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. So it's the mental health for youth part of the NHS. Could fill WAVE project courses over and over and over. I know every project around the country, the WAVE project has a waiting list now. But how we got to that stage was actually through a process of conducting, you know, fairly rigorous evaluation. It certainly wasn't something that was going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but we were using validated tools. We were taking a pre and post test. We were gathering as much qualitative data as we could. And we were speaking to different stakeholders. We were inviting clinicians down to the beach to come and see what was happening. And it was a process of building up trust. And I think I wish the evidence around surf therapy that exists now had been there then, because it might have made some of those initial conversations a bit easier. But certainly building up trust with health organizations, with social care, because they have so many boxes they have to tick in terms of, quite rightly, you know, looking after their young people's well-being. So certainly that sort of evidence-based approach from day one, and I have to, you know, I have to give Joe Taylor, who founded the WAVE project, the credit for that, because his sort of him making me do that evaluation of that pilot probably started the very initial steps of the research sort of career I've taken since. And seeing the power of that evaluation certainly was really quite something. So I certainly encourage, you know, anyone who's in that early stage, you really do want to make sure you're exploring the impact you're having in a rigorous manner. And there's certainly resources that we can make available, and there's resources out there to help do that. And then maintaining that trust as well has been really sort of important, and I know at times difficult element, because, you know, I'd say, for going back to my very first answer, the amount of time I spent making sure the intervention was a safe space. You know, it was about training volunteers. It was about making sure participants on their worst day still, you know, just had the experience they wanted, or even, you know, the number of times I sat on a Scottish beach building sandcastles. I'm just having a chat because, you know, that day the guys didn't want to go in the water, and then being able to be plugged in with the support services they're working with in an integrated manner, to then be part of that overall care package. I think that was the thing I was most proud of when I left the WAVE project, is that the WAVE project was seen as an integrated service for local healthcare and social services. And that's kind of the goal we sort of want to get to, where we're accepted and part of that process, and we're all talking to each other to make sure that the individual we're working with can feel better, or whatever their main target is. I would say that trust at times can be challenging, because there's an awful lot of stuff out there. And to go back to one of our earlier points, not every sporting program is clear on their impact, and they are just sort of delivering some support and saying there's, you know, mental health associated. So some clinicians and organizations are quite rightly a little suspicious when we do approach them with these kinds of things. And it's up to us to kind of show them that, you know, we have all the things we've been discussing in the sort of first part of this webinar. We are focused on that. We are focused on our safe spaces. We are intentional about what we want to achieve. We know the population we want to work with intimately. We've got, you know, actors from within that community, if it's all possible, involved. You know, it's up to us to sort of demonstrate that, to you know, enable that integrated approach that has worked really well up in Scotland. I think I went on a bit of a tangent there, Tim, so I hope that answers the original question.
No surprise, Jamie, no surprise. No, you answered it well.
I just jump in just to
yeah.
Can I just jump in? So, I mean, Jamie, what you're saying is spot on. You know, I particularly love that you said you had the staff, you know, the trust is key, absolutely. You said that, you know, you had them, they came down to the beach with you, and that was key. What I would say is take it a step further, put them in the water. Now, we've got some good evidence that from work that we've done here in Australia is that we're trying to roll out these lifestyle, and I'm going to use that term, lifestyle interventions, so encompassing dietary-based stuff within mental health settings. We need the staff involved, intervention for themselves. Because what that can do is it can change their attitudes, it can build confidence, it can change knowledge, and reduce some of the barriers, and then they'll become, as Jamie says, the advocates for the program. So it is absolutely key, but we need to change the culture of that workforce. And the best way for that to happen is actually let them experience exactly what it is that we're going to be doing. And I think for the physical activity world and the mental health world, that's actually really critical, because there's a lot of people, within mental health that maybe they don't have a positive view of physical activity. So maybe they're concerned about, well, they don't want to advocate to take their clients to do something that they don't understand or they don't feel comfortable doing. And there's some links I can share around the thing on staff. If you have limited resources, limited time, just focus on staff.
Simon, it's such a powerful message there. And I think what we've all learned over the years is that the role of your coaches or your staff in delivering the programs where safe space is such a core kind of component, your staff they are one of the key linchpins of the service. So good trained staff, I think, is essential. I think it's a really cool point. And just conscious that we've got about 20 minutes left and there's a couple of good questions I'd love to create time to address. So just one more question to both of you guys. Simon, you mentioned earlier that the link between physical activity and positive mental health outcomes is now very well established. There's lots and lots of evidence around that. And just looking at who's joined us today, I just want to ask a question that's hopefully going to be practical for all of us. As practitioners on the field, we're getting lots of young people physically active. Are there simple things we can do to measure that impact? Bearing in mind that a lot of us are relatively small non-profit organizations. Everyone's very busy delivering a program, making sure it's as good as possible. How can we contribute to this growing pool of evidence? Are there simple things we can measure? So both of you, whoever wants to go first.
I think Simon's just having a tiny bit of internet problem, so I'll jump in first, and then hopefully Simon can sort of jump in with after.
Oh. Sorry, I am back. You go, Jamie, please, because I didn't hear that question. I'm sorry for the internet trouble.
No worries. I'll phrase my answer with the question in it for everyone's benefit. But yeah, in terms of trying to simple ways of measuring our impact and exploring our impact from a sort of evaluation capacity, there's certainly lots of tools out there. There's again, it comes back to Simon's point again. Firstly, you need to be, and this process of evaluating what we're doing is a great way of making sure we are clear about what we're trying to impact and who we're trying to impact, because unless you're clear on that question, you cannot measure it. It's the very first, when I work with partners on their evaluation, the very first thing we have to do is be very clear on, okay, well, what is the question we want to answer? If that question is my program impactful? Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Are we talking, as Simon said, well-being? Are we talking about symptom reduction in a specific population? So yeah, absolutely. That's the first step, is being very clear on what we want to measure. And then there are lots of tools out there. There's lots of freely available tools, simple pre-post tests. Again, I think one of the big problems in our whole paradigm sometimes is if it's not peer-reviewed RCTs, it's not worth doing, and that's just not that's absolutely not true. Doing a pre-post without a control, yes, there's challenges around that, but it's great for you as an organization to sort of, myself and Tim have a thing we do with training where we talk about evaluation as a ladder, and there's simple things we need to do before we can move on to those more advanced things. So for example, a lot of interventions we've worked with struggle around measuring attendance. As Simon's mentioned, as I will totally agree with, the amount of exposure your participants are getting to your program is a hugely important metric we need to understand. If for example, it seems like your intervention is not working, it may be just that the participants not getting enough exposure to it. you know, things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of tools out there. I don't want to list them all now because I don't think that would be a good use of our time, but certainly we can share. I know the International Surf Therapy Organization have a cool little framework that certainly anyone not involved with surfing can go look at, and lists a range of wellbeing tools, how to use them, how to analyze them, different ways of doing qualitative research. So certainly, yeah, there's lots of things out there. And if anyone is looking for specifics, I would say try and reach out to your local academic institution. There's always people willing to help. And if they're not willing to help, yeah, give me a shout. I think my PhD supervisor is on the call and he will be shouting me not to say that as I'm trying to write up my thesis. But yeah, there are people out there who are more than willing to help you with the specifics of how we can measure those questions. But the primary thing is figure out the question we want to answer very clearly before we go trying to figure out how we do it.
Cool. And Simon, yeah, similar question to you. I think just a couple of minutes and then we'll jump into some of the questions in the chat group. But understanding that, just to repeat the question because I know your internet dropped, you mentioned earlier the link between physical activity and positive mental health outcomes is quite well established. For community-based organizations such as ourselves in the field, are there super simple things we can be measuring that can help us contribute to the growing evidence pool? You know, it could be something as simple as attendance. It might be focus groups. Like, are there simple things that we can measure?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing thinking about research or thinking about evaluation, I mean, there's a difference between different types of research. So we've got efficacy research, there's effectiveness research, there's implementation research. There's a difference between efficacy and effectiveness. And efficacy is asking the question, does something work? In the ideal environment, does it work? So does physical activity improve mental health? Yes, it does. We don't need more efficacy research telling us that it's effective. The idea of effectiveness is, does something work in the real world? We absolutely need more of that research. And then implementation research saying, well, how do we actually implement this? How do we actually, you know, there's a whole field of implementation science. They're actually guiding implementation. So that's what we need. So, you know, asking the question, you know, we've got this great program, be it surfing, be it rock climbing, be it mountain biking, saying, does this improve mental health outcomes? It's probably not the best question that we need answered at the moment. What we need answers is, how does this work in specific context? So I think the best thing people can do, I mean, my advice is actually understand who is your audience. Who are you? Who are your clients, your beneficiaries, whatever the term might be? Who are the people you're working with? And what I've seen from the charities that I've worked with and great community-based programs is that they often struggle to be able to articulate from their data, who are they reaching? You know, who are their people? And I think that's the most important thing that they could be doing, is actually working on your simple database around attendance, around demographics. Who are the people you're working with? And from there, that's sets the foundation, it sets a platform to then allow more complicated methodologies and you know, impact research to be done. But I think the first thing is, you know, I'd agree with Jamie. I understand what the question is. I think often with evaluation, starting with the endpoint, think about the report you're writing or think about who you're trying to give it to, because it's easy to get carried away or get lost in the different options available. And next thing, you're collecting all this data and have no idea what we're actually doing with it, or who cares.
Awesome. Thank you. And a shameless plug, but we have just developed an attendance tracking platform within Ways for Change that I'll add to the notes that follow this. It's a simple app that you can use in the field that's been used across Africa at the moment, which is kind of cool. So again, it's understanding who's coming to your program, where are they from, and I think that's like you say, that adherence measure as well. Like how often, who are they, how often are they coming? Like super simple metrics that can help us track what we're doing. So that's, Simon, that's awesome.
And also answer the question of who isn't coming, which I think is really important.
Yes. Yeah, like you said, it's also creating that access, isn't it? And making sure that the most at-risk people are accessing our service. I think that's, yeah, thank you, Simon. So what I'm going to do is just go on to the questions. We've got about 10 minutes left and there's some great questions in there. Hopefully I can cover all of them. The first one that I wanted to chat, quick one, was from a friend of ours here called Crick Lund, who is a researcher that's been kind to donate a lot of his time to Ways for Change. In summary, Crick, apologies if I butcher your question, but is there evidence that physical activity programs can work as preventative interventions, so preventing anxiety, preventing depression?
I was going to let Simon jump in there. I think he's probably got the better answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Jamie.
Yeah.
Yes, there's some really good data showing that physical activity can help prevent depression and sorry, I think there's a bit of a delay on my connection, but essentially, yes. And there's some papers that I'll share from Felipe Schuch in Brazil. Some, really taken together. If we got the population moving, by as little as about 60 minutes of physical activity per week, we prevent somewhere between, it's around 18% of incident cases of depression worldwide. So yes, there is good data around prevention. It's difficult to measure, to determine that a program has prevented things. You need longitudinal studies. They're really expensive. They take a lot of resources and they take a lot of time, because it obviously takes time to measure that. But yeah, if we get people moving, we can prevent certain cases of depression and anxiety.
Also, and Simon, if you're able to share those papers, what I'll do is I'll put them in the minutes and the links to this talk afterwards. So the next question, because I think, Simon, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. The second one is from Paul, and I think it's an interesting one. So, is the positive impacts that we see from these programs, are they physiological as a result of participation in physical activity? Or are they as a result of the beneficiaries being put in protective environmental situations? So is it a physiological response that we're experiencing, which is promoting our mental health? Or is it because we're entering into communities where we feel that we connect with other people? What's your opinions on that one? Jamie, do you want to go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to be a classic sort of researcher here and just totally sit on the fence.
Go first, Jamie.
Oh, right. Sorry.
It's absolutely both. We know there's acute affective.
Simon, I think we've got some Aussie internet issues. Are you able to hear us? And if you want to take the answer to the question, go for it.
I think I'm on a massive delay. I'm sorry, Jamie, you go. That's why. Jamie, you go.
Okay, I'll just jump in for now. But Simon, please just jump in and add on afterwards. That's grand. Yeah, I absolutely think it's both. I've seen in my research that we've talked about the social components, we've talked about safe spaces, we've talked about the important role of coaches, and certainly some of those are sort of really psychosocial mechanisms around support, around being able to open up, being able to provide almost like these especially in low resource settings, these access to services that otherwise participants may not have. But certainly the actual physical activity component, as Simon has said, the evidence is very clear that the physical activity component has a certain as an impact as well. And beyond that, some of my research in particular, one of my research priorities for after my PhD is finished is exploring, we've seen in some of my surf therapy research specifically, when you find these activities that are completely all encompassing and they demand your focus, it seems to give participants respite from negative sort of mental health symptoms. So one thing, and the other thing is those states are mirroring something called a flow state, which is more commonly studied in performance psychology in terms of, it's commonly known as being in the zone. So certainly I'm really interested in exploring if these activities and the flow states that they may lead to can actually have an anxiolytic or an antidepressant effect. It should be noted that effect is short-term, but a short-term effect is still very valuable to the participants who take part in it. So I certainly think there's both, and I think that sort of that combination of the two of the sort of physical activity increases, or the combination of the three, even the physical activity increases, the direct sort of impact of these activities, which are demanding participants' focus. I mean, the most common quote I've had in all of my surf therapy research is around leaving worries or anxieties at the beach. I've heard it in every context, from West Africa to the East Coast of Australia. And there seems to be something really powerful in that. So a combination of that, the link we know already with physical activity and these sort of psychosocial structures of safe spaces and the coaches we've talked so much around, I think they all come together to create that perfect storm of really having that impact. And again, I think it's just worth noting, look at all the things we've taught there. They can be applied in a range of settings. And we talk about mental health through sport on this call, but all of those, in my opinion, none of them are actually specifically tied to, certainly not any particular sport, but even sport in itself. And that's where there's valuable things that can be done within creative arts, within, we talked about the gardening going on in Somalia and things like that. So there's certainly, if we understand these better, and it ties back to that, to sort of future research priorities, the more we can understand that link, the more we can understand the question you're asking, Paul, the better we can sort of add to our toolbox of what local practitioners can then implement within their settings in the way that they see best.
Thanks, Jamie. Simon, do you want to have a quick go as well? I think it looks like we've got you back as well.
I can try. There was a massive delay, and then I was watching my recording interrupt. Look, I'd just say, Paul, I think it's both. It is that, the social stuff, it is the physiological stuff, and at any one point in time, it could be a combination or a mixture, and that could change. So I think it's difficult to say that it's one at any one point in time. It's going to vary, and it depends on.
Awesome. Thanks, Simon. Thanks for persevering through the internet delay as well. I think from our side, just in South Africa as well, we've done a couple of studies looking at the physiological response of young people, and we found it, but in the qualitative data, in the focus groups, the interviews that we have with the young people, we also find that their connection to culturally sensitive adults that offer them a slightly different caring adult connection or experience of connection is also fundamental in their enjoyment of the program as well. So it's difficult to tease apart. It's something I'd love to interrogate more, and I'm sure it's something we'll do more in the future. But Jamie and Simon, thanks so much for your answers there. The last one, and this is purely kind of practical one, because Julia, I see you've been very active on the group, and I want to try and get to one of your questions. I guess, yeah, Simon and Jamie, you've been out in Liberia as well, and it goes back to that kind of cultural sensitivity, that access question. And we had this conversation with Chris, actually, Dennis from Trinidad on the last call. Chris is in a very rural community in Trinidad. His surf therapy intervention really is the only thing that's happening in the village. Knowing that the coaches are the linchpin of his work, they offer the safe space, the connection, they understand the community. If you're working in a country like Vietnam, as Julia is, how do you find those kind of diamond coaches that are going to take your program forwards? Have you found methods in your research, or Jamie, in what you did in Scotland or what you saw in Liberia? Are there ways of finding these people? How do you have any recommendations on how you might find a coach? I know it's slightly more program and less in theory and less kind of research based, but have you seen any ways or methods of recruiting really passionate, really caring local adults for these programs?
I think I can speak to certainly a few of the things I saw in Liberia and some of the stuff I experienced with in Scotland, because, well, actually in Scotland, we recruit a lot of volunteers, and finding the right volunteers are integral to the program. And while it is slightly different, I think some of the things will translate across. And certainly a bit to Simon's point around just getting people down and involved. If there's a way you can get people involved in what you're trying to do almost before you start delivering it on a larger scale, if you can get people down, and I think it's a lot of the time, once you get people almost trialing things already, and once you get them engaged with maybe running some trial sessions and just having a go and having fun with it, and it's something you can make quite it can be about capacity building for local community members as well, which is an awesome thing to do. I think certainly you can see it's those people, I guess, that get it right away. It's kind of like the people who helped me set up the Wave project right away when they just got it, and the people who I guess just have a clear passion for it. I certainly feel when I was working in Liberia with Waves for Change, it was just so evident to me that for some of the coaches, this was just their life. They really just cared so much about the kids, and they were really just going above and beyond at every stage. And again, yeah, I would love to know how they were recruited from a waste for change point of view. But yeah, I think just if there's a way to get people almost involved beforehand and see them on the ground. I mean, it sounds like, I guess that sounds like common sense in terms of just getting people involved and seeing how they go. But certainly we had people down at the beach before they worked with young people, had them having fun, trying to help each other in the water, as part of our volunteer training, as it were. And it was quite evident quite early on, the volunteers who I, ended up then leaning on very heavily to actually deliver our programs in Scotland. So yeah, getting people in the water, as it were, whether your program is water-based or not, I'd certainly say is a really good first step.
Awesome. Simon?
If I've got 30 seconds to add on that, I would say find people that are already doing something. Even if it's not the same thing, there will be someone doing something, and if not, look harder, because you will find, and then work with them as a start. The second thing is the ability to graduate people. So if you have participants, you can graduate them to become the peer workers or peer support, and we've done that throughout our programs, everywhere. So I think look locally and then train locally.
Awesome, Julia. I hope that's useful for you. And yes, Jamie and Simon, thanks for your insights on that. So sadly, we've come up to the end of the hour. We have recorded this and we are going to share it. Simon and Jamie, thanks so much for your time. Simon, I know it's late down there in Australia, so thank you so much for staying up. Very, very brief kind of summary of kind of what we discussed. The idea of what are some of these big ingredients of these programs. We spoke about safe spaces, the physical safe space, the emotional safe space, the role that these mentors have in creating a space that's culturally sensitive, mentors that understand the lived experience of the young people that they're working with, who can create access to the most vulnerable. I think the mentors are really important. Simon spoke really articulately on the activities that we use, making sure that they're fun, not to the person that's designing the program, but to the people that are going to experience the program. If it's fun and they enjoy the program, that probably means they're going to come more often, and adherence is a big predictor of successful outcomes. And then also understanding who is it that we're working with, so that we can understand, do we need to provide additional services to these people? Have they got needs that we might not be able to meet ourselves, and where else in our community can we access this help? I think, we're going to record this. We're going to release it. In the notes, we'll add links to some of the journals that were cited by Simon and Jamie. We'll also put a couple of resources for practitioners in the field. We've got some really useful tools to conduct focus groups in the field to understand, are my young people, are my participants enjoying my service? We have this attendance tracking app if you want to track adherence to your program. We'll hopefully be able to create another platform like this at some point in the next month or so. This is the second of the two webinars that we initially planned. So Julia, I'm glad that was useful. So from my side, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Simon. I know David's on the call from the Postcodes Foundation, so thank you, David, for supporting this and getting this up and running. I hope it was interesting. The email will go out probably the next day or two. And please, please, please just respond and bug us, because we have tools that we're very happy to share. So if there's anything on this that was useful, you'll get an email from us in a day or two, and feel free just to spam us as much as you'd like to. Mostly, Simon, thank you for staying up late. And I hope you have a good night's sleep down there. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Tim. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming, logging in.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So that concludes the call. The recording will be with you soon. Bye, Tash, and see you soon. Bye. And look after yourselves. And any follow-up questions, do drop us an email. Thanks a lot.